It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. A group of 5 friends, Sarah, Mike, Emily, David, and Lisa, had rented an old cabin deep in the woods for a weekend of hiking, campfires, and relaxation. The cabin was charming, with its rustic wood interior and cozy fireplace, but it also had an air of isolation, nestled far from the nearest town. On the first night, as they sat around the fire roasting marshmallows, they noticed the woods seemed unusually quiet. No sounds of crickets or owls, just an eerie silence. They shrugged it off, attributing it to being city folk unaccustomed to the deep woods. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. Emily, who had gone to fetch more firewood, returned pale and shaken. She claimed she saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. The others laughed it off, teasing her about seeing things in the dark. Around midnight, Sarah decided to go to bed. She headed into the cabin and climbed the creaky stairs to the bedroom. As she was brushing her teeth, she heard faint whispers. At first, she thought it was the others outside, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct, yet still unintelligible. She looked around, her heart pounding, but saw no one. The next morning, they found strange symbols etched into the wooden door of the cabin, symbols none of them recognized. David, the most skeptical of the group, dismissed it as a prank by some local kids. They spent the day hiking and tried to forget about it, but an unease lingered. That evening, while gathered around the fireplace again, the whispers returned. This time, everyone heard them. They seemed to come from all around, echoing through the cabin. Lisa suggested they should leave, but David insisted they stay, not wanting to cut their trip short over some silly noises. Later that night, they were jolted awake by a loud thumping on the roof. It sounded like heavy footsteps, moving slowly but purposefully. They huddled together, terrified, as the footsteps moved to the side of the cabin and then stopped. Silence fell once more, and they dared not move. Suddenly, the front door flew open with a deafening crash, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The symbols on the door glowed faintly in the moonlight. Panic set in, and they decided to leave immediately. They grabbed their essentials and ran to their car, not looking back. As they sped away down the narrow forest road, they saw it. A shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road, eyes glowing a deep, menacing red. Mike swerved to avoid it, nearly crashing into a tree. When they looked back, the figure was gone. They reached the nearest town by dawn, exhausted and shaken. They told the locals what had happened, but most dismissed it as a combination of overactive imaginations and the isolation of the woods. However, one old man listened intently. He told them that the cabin had a dark history, once belonging to a reclusive man rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals. The man had disappeared years ago, and the cabin had been abandoned ever since. The friends never spoke of that night again, but they all knew what they had experienced was real. The whispers, the footsteps, the shadowy figure. It all stayed with them, haunting their dreams. The cabin in the woods remained a place of nightmares, a dark and eerie reminder of the unseen horrors that lurk just beyond the firelight. Years passed, but the memories of that harrowing night never faded for Sarah, Mike, Emily, David, and Lisa. They tried to move on, but the sense of unease lingered in the back of their minds, especially on quiet, dark nights. One evening, Sarah received a mysterious package at her apartment. Inside was an old, leather-bound journal covered in dust and grime. A note was attached. "Found this in the attic of the cabin. Thought you might want to see it. Tom." Tom was the old man from the town near the cabin. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered his words about the cabin's dark history. Sarah invited her friends over to go through the journal together. They gathered around her dining table, the journal sitting ominously in the center. With a deep breath, Sarah opened it. The journal belonged to the reclusive man who had once lived in the cabin. His entries were filled with disturbing details about his obsession with dark rituals and summoning otherworldly entities. He wrote about hearing whispers from the woods, seeing shadowy figures, and feeling an ever-present sense of being watched. As they read further, They found an entry dated just a week before the man's disappearance. It described a ritual he had performed to summon a watcher in the woods, a malevolent spirit bound to protect the cabin. The man detailed how he had drawn the same symbols they had seen etched into the cabin door, and how he had heard the spirit's footsteps on the roof that very night. He wrote about the terror he felt, realizing too late that he had summoned something far more powerful and evil than he had anticipated. The last entry was short and desperate. "The Watcher is here. It will not let me leave. I am trapped in my own creation. If anyone finds this, beware the cabin and the darkness it holds." The room grew colder as they read the final words. Emily noticed her breath forming mist in the air. They all felt a presence, a familiar sense of dread that they had experienced in the cabin years ago. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Panic set in as they heard heavy footsteps on the roof, just like that fateful night. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, impossible to understand but filled with malice. Desperate, they grabbed their phones for light, but the screens flickered and died. The footsteps moved from the roof to the walls, surrounding them. They huddled together, terrified and helpless. Just when it seemed like the darkness would consume them, the whispers stopped, and the lights flickered back on. The room was empty except for them, and the oppressive presence was gone. They were left shaken, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They knew they had to do something to stop the entity for good. Researching old rituals and protection spells, they found one that might work. It required them to return to the cabin and perform a counter-ritual to banish the spirit. With great reluctance, they agreed to face their fears and return to the cabin. Armed with the necessary materials and a newfound determination, they made their way back to the dreaded place. As they approached, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around them. Inside the cabin, they quickly set up for the ritual. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the whispers already starting to creep in. They drew a protective circle on the floor, surrounded by candles, and began chanting the incantation they had learned. The whispers grew louder, the air vibrated with a malevolent energy, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe around them. The temperature dropped further, and they could see their breath forming in front of them. Suddenly, the shadowy figure appeared in the doorway, its eyes glowing red with fury. Tried to enter the circle, but the barrier held it back. They continued chanting, their voices growing stronger and more confident. With one final, deafening roar, the figure dissipated into a cloud of dark smoke, which then vanished. The cabin fell silent, the oppressive presence lifting. The ritual had worked. They left the cabin, vowing never to return. The nightmare was finally over, and they felt a sense of peace they hadn't felt in years. Though the memory of that night would never fully fade, they knew they had faced the darkness and won. The cabin in the woods would remain abandoned, a silent witness to the horrors that had once unfolded within its walls. Years passed, and the 5 friends went their separate ways, each trying to move on from the nightmare that had haunted them. Sarah became a teacher, Mike a software engineer, Emily a nurse, David a writer, and Lisa an artist. They stayed in touch but rarely spoke of the cabin or the events that had transpired there. One autumn afternoon, David received a call from an unknown number. Hesitant, he answered, and the voice on the other end sent chills down his spine. It was Tom, the old man who had sent them the journal. He sounded frantic, urging David to gather his friends and come to the town immediately. "It's about the cabin," Tom said, his voice shaking. "Something's happening, and you need to see it." David felt a sense of dread but knew he couldn't ignore the call. He contacted Sarah, Mike, Emily, and Lisa, and despite their reluctance, they agreed to meet in the town. The journey was filled with an uneasy silence, each of them lost in their thoughts and memories of the past. When they arrived, they found Tom waiting for them at a small, dilapidated diner. He looked older and more worn than they remembered. He wasted no time in explaining the situation. "People have been going missing," he said, his eyes wide with fear. "Hikers, campers, even locals. all last seen near the cabin. Tom led them to the edge of the forest, where they met with a group of concerned townsfolk. They had set up a temporary camp, with maps and charts spread out on tables, trying to make sense of the disappearances. One of the locals, a young woman named Claire, showed them photographs of the missing people. Each photo had a familiar symbol etched on it, the same symbols they had seen on the cabin door. "We think the spirit you encountered wasn't fully banished," Claire explained. "It's been growing stronger, and it's reaching out further into the forest." The group felt a sense of urgency. They knew they had to return to the cabin, not just to save the missing people, but to end the terror once and for all. Armed with new rituals and protective charms provided by Claire and the townsfolk, they set out for the cabin one last time. As they approached, the forest grew eerily silent, and the air felt thick with malevolence. The cabin loomed in the distance, looking even more foreboding than before. They entered cautiously, and immediately felt the oppressive presence surrounding them. They set up their protective circle and began the ritual, chanting the incantations they had learned. The air grew colder, and the whispers started again, louder and more insistent. The ground beneath them trembled, and the shadowy figure reappeared, more terrifying than ever. This time, however, they were prepared. They held their ground, chanting with determination and focus. The figure roared in fury, trying to break through the barrier, but it was held back by the power of their combined will and the protective charms. Suddenly, the ground outside the cabin erupted, and the missing people emerged from the earth, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. The shadowy figure writhed and twisted, its form becoming less defined. The friends intensified their chanting, drawing on every ounce of their strength. With a final, deafening scream, the figure disintegrated into nothingness. The oppressive presence lifted, and the air grew warm again. The whispers ceased, and the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The missing people were dazed but unharmed, and the friends helped them back to the town. The townsfolk were overjoyed and grateful, and they held a small celebration to thank Sarah, Mike, Emily, David, and Lisa for their bravery. As they sat around a bonfire, the friends felt a sense of closure. They had faced their deepest fears and emerged victorious. The cabin, now empty and devoid of its dark presence, would slowly be reclaimed by the forest, its secrets buried forever. They knew that the experience had changed them, forging an unbreakable bond between them. And though the memory of the haunted cabin would always be with them, they felt a profound sense of peace, knowing they had finally put the darkness to rest. Despite the peace they found, the experience left an indelible mark on Sarah, Mike, Emily, David, and Lisa. They tried to return to their normal lives, but the echoes of the past still lingered, lurking in the shadows of their minds. Months after their final confrontation at the cabin, David began to experience strange occurrences. Objects in his apartment would move on their own, and he often felt an icy chill despite the warmth of the season. One night, as he worked late on his latest novel, he heard faint whispers, the same malevolent whispers from the cabin. Panicking, he called Sarah, who was always the most level-headed of the group. She listened as he described the events and assured him she would gather the others. Within hours, they were all at David's apartment, unease etched on their faces. As they discussed what to do next, Emily, who had been researching ancient rituals and folklore, suggested that perhaps the spirit had latched onto one of them during their last visit to the cabin. "It might not be over," she said, her voice trembling. "We might have brought something back with us." Determined to find answers, they reached out to Claire and the townsfolk who had helped them before. Claire suggested a more powerful and ancient ritual, one that required them to return to the cabin and perform a final exorcism to sever any remaining ties with the entity. Reluctantly, they agreed to return once more. Armed with new rituals, protective amulets, and a sense of purpose, they ventured back into the foreboding forest. This time, they noticed that the trees seemed to close in on them more than before, and the air was thick with an almost tangible sense of dread. Inside the cabin, they quickly set up their protective circle and began the ritual. The air grew cold, and the whispers returned, louder and more aggressive. The cabin seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the shadowy figure reappeared, more menacing and tangible than ever. As they chanted the ancient incantations, the ground shook, and the figure roared in fury. The symbols they had drawn began to glow, and the protective circle wavered under the force of the entity's rage. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, feeding off their fear. Lisa, who had been silently praying, suddenly stood up and walked towards the shadowy figure. The others tried to stop her, but she seemed entranced, moving as if guided by an unseen force. She began to chant in a language none of them recognized, her voice strong and unwavering. The figure recoiled, its form flickering and weakening. Lisa continued, her eyes glowing with a strange light. The others joined in, their voices merging with hers, creating a powerful resonance that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. With a final, anguished scream, the figure disintegrated into a cloud of dark smoke, which was sucked out of the cabin and into the night sky. The oppressive presence lifted, and the air grew warm and still. The whispers ceased, and the cabin seemed to exhale a sigh of relief. Lisa collapsed, exhausted but unharmed. The others rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. They knew that this time, the darkness was truly gone. The cabin, now an empty shell, would finally be at peace. As they left the forest for the last time, they felt a sense of closure and resolution. They had faced the darkness within and without, and emerged stronger for it. The bond between them was now unbreakable, forged in the crucible of their shared experience. Back in their everyday lives, the strange occurrences ceased. David's apartment was peaceful again, and the whispers were gone. Each of them carried a small token of the experience, a protective amulet, a symbol of their victory over the darkness, and a reminder of the strength they had found in themselves and each other. Years later, they would occasionally reunite, sharing stories of their lives and the adventures they had embarked on. But they always remembered the cabin and the shadowy figure that had once haunted their dreams. It became a part of their history, a tale they would tell with a mix of fear and pride, knowing that they had faced the darkness and won. Years passed, and the friends continued to find peace in their lives, though the bond they shared remained as strong as ever. They stayed in touch, meeting regularly to catch up and share their lives. The experience at the cabin was something they rarely spoke about, yet it had woven an unbreakable thread through the fabric of their friendship. One autumn evening, 10 years after their final confrontation with the entity, the group gathered at Sarah's house for a reunion. The air was crisp, and the leaves had turned a vibrant array of reds and oranges, creating a picturesque backdrop for their meeting. They laughed, reminisced, and enjoyed the warmth of their companionship. As the night deepened, Lisa brought out an old wooden box. She had kept it hidden away, feeling now was the right time to reveal its contents. Inside were their protective amulets, the ones they had used during the final ritual. Each one was a small, intricately carved symbol of their victory over the darkness. "I thought we should each have these back," Lisa said, her voice tinged with emotion, "to remind us of what we overcame together." They each took their amulet, feeling the weight and significance of the small tokens. As they sat around the fire, sharing stories and memories, a sense of unease began to creep in. Emily, always attuned to the supernatural, felt a familiar chill run down her spine. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, sensing a change in the atmosphere. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen and twist around them. The whispers, those dreaded whispers, returned, faint at first but growing louder. Sarah stood up, her face set with determination. "We need to finish this once and for all." They agreed, knowing they couldn't escape the past. They decided to return to the cabin the next day, determined to put an end to whatever remnants of darkness remained. As they prepared to leave, they gathered their protective charms and the journal, their only guide to the supernatural forces they had faced. The journey to the cabin was filled with tension and anticipation. The forest seemed darker, more menacing than before, as if it were alive with malevolent energy. When they arrived, the cabin stood as a silent sentinel, waiting for their return. Inside, they quickly set up their protective circle and began the ritual once more. The whispers grew louder, the air thick with an oppressive presence. The shadowy figure reappeared, its form more defined and threatening than ever. But this time they were not afraid. They chanted the incantations with renewed strength, their voices merging into a powerful harmony. The figure writhed and twisted, its eyes glowing with fury. The ground shook, and the cabin seemed to pulse with dark energy. Suddenly, the journal in Sarah's hands began to glow. She opened it, finding a new incantation written in a language she didn't recognize. Lisa, still attuned to the strange language from their last encounter, began to chant the new words, her voice strong and clear. The others joined in, their voices blending with hers. The shadowy figure roared, its form flickering and weakening. The protective circle glowed brighter, and the symbols on the walls began to fade. With one final, agonizing scream, the figure disintegrated into a cloud of dark smoke, which was sucked into the journal. The oppressive presence lifted, and the air grew warm and still. The whispers ceased, and the cabin seemed to exhale a sigh of relief. They closed the journal, feeling the weight of their victory. The darkness was finally gone, banished for good. The cabin, now an empty shell, would be at peace, and the forest would reclaim it. As they left the forest for the last time, they felt a sense of closure and resolution. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger for it. The bond between them was now unbreakable, forged in the crucible of their shared experience. Back in their everyday lives, they found true peace. The strange occurrences ceased, and the whispers were gone. Each of them carried their protective amulet, a symbol of their victory and a reminder of the strength they had found in themselves and each other. Years later, they would occasionally reunite, sharing stories of their lives and the adventures they had embarked on. But they always remembered the cabin and the shadowy figure that had once haunted their dreams. It became a part of their history, a tale they would tell with a mix of fear and pride, knowing that they had faced the darkness and won. And so, the legend of the haunted cabin in the woods lived on, not as a tale of terror, but as a testament to the unbreakable bond of friendship and the enduring strength of the human spirit.